Now, this week at the Cambridge Arts Theatre, something very exciting indeed, and so exciting that Nicola and I this week went all the way to Windsor, had a very lovely afternoon out, going to their wonderful theatre, which is Theatre Royal Windsor, isn't it?
It is indeed. Well,
Theatre
could it
Royal
be anything
Windsor.
else?
Well, it couldn't actually, no, best P's and Q's there. We went along to see Round the Horne. Now, of course, for those of you that remember Sunday lunchtimes when we were treated to the likes of Billy Cotton's band show, came after the family favourites, of course, and then the lunchtime round, just as the sprouts were being dished up and everything else, we were also treated to Round the Horne and, of course, the Clitheroe Kid. Well, Round the Horne grew and grew and grew, just like Topsy, and then eventually, of course, disappeared from our radio sets on the onslaught of local radio and all that brings with it. We can now look back at Round the Horne with great nostalgia. After the show this week at Windsor, I went backstage to have a chat with the cast in anticipation of seeing them this week at the Cambridge Arts Theatre. Well, first of all, Stephen Matthews. Stephen, you play Kenneth Williams, and of course, I guess out of all the cast, Kenneth Williams' character is known for hundreds of reasons and not just Round the Horne. I would probably think that you have the most difficult role, bearing that in mind, because playing a very, very famous person. I mean, how do you become Kenneth Williams? How do you begin to become Kenneth Williams?
It's very difficult because everybody has, as you say, a very vivid imprint in their memory as to how he was, not only vocally, which Round the Horne deals with, but also physically. And in our show, when we're not at the mic doing our bits, we're sitting on chairs at the back, and you still have to be Kenneth Williams. And if all of a sudden I wasn't, I think people would they'd know straight away. And how you become Kenneth Williams is, there is so much documented about him, about his life, the diaries, the letters, the biographies, the autobiographies, everything. There are all the carry-on films, of course, and the other things that he did. So there's a huge library of stuff to kind of pillage, to kind of try and get the essence of the man. I did a play, the carry-on play by Terry Johnson last year, so I did a lot of research into the man himself. That kind of stood me in good stead for this, although this is more kind of about the voices and his kind of golden era rather than the more troubled times that play deals with. But there's a huge amount of stuff there, and you just have to kind of keep your fingers tightly crossed that you kind of get a little bit near it for people.
The history of Round the Horne, and of course for those of us that remember it back in the 1960s, the special thing about it was that it was a golden age of radio because it was pretty much a live audience. The whole of the performance was done live so that everybody could see the sound effects man and everything else. And that has been so beautifully recreated on this actual stage show. It couldn't have worked without that, could it?
I don't think so, no. I mean, it has to be that experience, because I mean, obviously people would have just sort of sat at home and listened to it on a Sunday lunchtime, and would be unaware of, maybe the bulk of the audience that come to see the show have never been to see a recording of any radio programme. So it's really nice that they kind of get that. They get the authenticity of the period and the style and everything.
Round the Horne, of course, I mean, it was a groundbreaker, and I note, and something that I didn't know at the time when I was listening to it as a child and not really understanding half of it, but just a few of the funnier bits, like Rambling Sid Rumpo, of course, was one of my favourite characters, and I gather you might even treat us in a moment or two to a little part folk song from him. But the amazing thing about Round the Horne was that the BBC themselves didn't even know or understand exactly what this bunch of people were creating.
Absolutely. I mean, we are dealing in a time of censorship where somebody would have sat there in the BBC and read that script. I suppose when you read the script, it's not the fact that it's there on the page. It's kind of almost more in the delivery of those actors, and that's how they turned it into something a little bit different.
And certainly different it was. Now, one of your partners in crime, David Rumelle, playing the wonderful character of Hugh Paddock, who also then transposes himself into so many other characters in the show. David, which is your favourite character that you actually play in this?
As Hugh Paddock? Well, the thing with Hugh Paddock, he's not so well documented as Kenneth Williams was, and there's not such a wealth of material to draw on. But he was such a tremendous radio actor to be able to do all these voices, and Brian Cook, the original writer, describes him as unsung hero of the piece, because he could do such versatile voices. I mean, in this show there's 15 of them, and they range from things like a character called Dentures, who is an announcer who comes on and says, "My lord, ladies, gentlemen, sprays the front row, and then you get people like Charles, out of Charles and Fiona, you've come, Fiona, that sort of thing. And then, of course, you get Julian to Kenneth Williams' Jewel and Sand. So it's all these characters that just fly by so quickly. I mean, you are going from one to the other in a split second.
How do you actually learn to control all these people? Because, I mean, that's an extraordinary feat in itself. With the Kenneth Williams characters, of course, they're very, very different in every way. One of them's an extraordinary folk singer, and you know, there are so many different people. The two characters that you play, the two gay men that you actually play in it, and we can actually say that these days. With, you know, hand on heart, isn't it extraordinary that we can actually now call them exactly what they were?
Yes.
Is a fascinating combination as well. But I mean, when you're just sitting there waiting for it all, are you actually reading that script that you carry about?
We have all learnt it, but because we're presenting a radio presentation, we do have to look as though we're reading the script. We have all learnt it solidly, but we have to give the impression that we're reading from it, because when the characters saw these scripts, they only had about 2 rehearsals, I believe, and then they were straight on to record. So we still have to give that impression we were in the radio studio.
It's also interesting that you're also giving the same impression of the men themselves. I mean, we talked about Kenneth Williams and how he was actually very, very disruptive during the production of these things. And even to this day, if you actually listen to sort of tapes and CDs that have been released of the original Round the Horn, you can hear Kenneth Williams in the background sounding off at any possible point.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he would do things like, there was actually a little trick thing that we were told that in the original recordings, that if they were running a little bit short of time and they needed a little filler in, they would give Kenneth Williams a signal from the box at the back, and at the given moment and signal, he would jump up and go into this long sort of tirade about how he wasn't appreciated. No, I'm not. You don't love. I'm not loved. And he'd just go off and off on one until they gave him the thumbs up, and you know that they'd filled the gap, and they would carry on.
I think it's time now for the two of you to share just a little for our listeners of that very famous duo, which of course in my day when I was actually listening to the original version of it, I used to be falling about all over the floor. These guys and Rambling Sid Rumpo were the things that I grew up with. Goodness knows what my parents were thinking at the time. I have no idea. We're talking about mid-60s here, when actually a lot of the stuff was virtually illegal, but they're moving on swiftly. Perhaps you treat us to a little of those famous gentlemen.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, the situation each week, Horne would see an advert for some organisation, and you'd hear him approaching the shop, and then the shop doorbell would go, and then all of a sudden... Oh, hello, I'm Julian, and this is my friend Sandy.
Oh, it's Mr. Horne. How boned to find your dolly old leak again.
Yes. Welcome to the Boner School of Cookery.
Tell him how you got started, Jewel.
What, into cooking?
What else?
Well, I suppose I was always into Fanny.
He was. That's the blessed Saint Fanny of the Craddocks. Her off the telly.
Yes, and her books. I've got all her books.
If there's a new Fanny about, he's like a man possessed.
Yes, I won't rest until I've got my hands on it. I've learnt all the recipes.
He's a Svengali with his steak, Mr. Horne. Give him a bit of rump, he'll do things with it, make your eyes stand out like organ stops. His steak and kidney pie is guaranteed to bring a smile to your ear.
Yes, and me fish.
Oh, yes, he's a dab hand with a dab. He's brill with brill, and as for the orange ruffy...
Yes, I do like a bit of ruffy.
Don't we all?
Isn't that John Dory, plump, white and firm, and so cheap you can do anything with it?
Tell him about your signature dish, Jewel.
Oh, I don't like.
Oh, go on, have a purge, go on.
All right, I'll do my own version of coq au vin. Yes, I've less cock, more van, and I add crudities.
Yes, crudities is absolutely boner. And his mince. Jewel has done more with his mince than any man I know. He makes a fantabulosa faggot.
Yes, I've done things with my faggots that no one else has ever attempted.
He has, and he's so fast. You should see him chop vegetables. Talk about speed. His chopper's a blur within seconds.
Oh, thank you, Sam. It's all practice.
Little thin strips of peppers, carrots, courgettes, all mixed up. I don't know what it's called.
Well, I suppose you'd call it a Julian a vegetable.
Oh, and he bowls.
I'll go too far.
Yeah, you do, too far.
That was absolutely fabulous. Stephen Matthews and David Rumelle there recalling those extraordinary days of Jules. And I always thought when I was a child it was Sandy.
Sandy, they were actually named after two of the sort of primary British composers at the time, Julian Slade, who wrote Salad Days, and Sandy Wilson, who wrote The Boyfriend.
And that's something we never knew, and would I have cared about when I was, well, about 3.5 or something. As far as the show goes, it's interesting because there are a lot of parodies, and I've only just realised this by seeing the show again today, having sort of so many years between actually listening to it on the radio and seeing it in the visual sense today. But the parodies are quite extraordinary, and obviously I remember in America we had Donovan and Bob Dylan, of course, right in the centre of things, which made it very, very special when Rambling Sid Rumpo, another sort of creation from Round the Horn, actually hit the stage. Now, in later years, I then went into the folk singing profession as a serious folk musician, and so I can greatly appreciate the ballads and the folk traditions, which, of course, now we all roll about to when Rambling Sid Rumpo actually puts them into some sort of perspective. I wonder if you would treat us to a little of one of his ditties.
Well, hello, me dearios. Since we last met, I've had a bogle in my gander bag, and I've come up with this astounding air fit to titillate your lummox. Joe, he was a young court wangler, monging greebles he did go, and he loved a bogler's daughter by the name of Chiswick Flo. Vain she was, and like a grusset, though her gander parts were fine, but she sneered at his court wangle as it hung upon the line. So he stole a waggler's mooly for to make a wedding ring, but the Bow Street runners caught him, and the judge said, "You will swing." Oh, they hung him by the pasterns, nailed his mooly to the fence, for to warn all young court wanglers that it was a great offence. There's a moral to the story, though your court wangle be poor. Keep your hands off others' moolies, for it is against the law.
Absolutely fabulous. We're so looking forward to the company coming to Cambridge this forthcoming week. We haven't spoken about the lady in your cast at the moment who also plays a multitude of extraordinary people. Perhaps you tell us a little bit about her, because we're not able to talk to her this afternoon.
Oh, Felicity, she plays Betty Marsden. Betty Marsden was the only lady in the Round the Horn company, and it was quite an extraordinary time because men tended to dominate the comedy circuit at the time, so it was quite an innovation to have her as the token lady in Round the Horn. But she was so good and so versatile at all these wonderful characters she played. I mean, she was every bit as versatile as Hugh Paddick and Kenneth Williams. Marvellous character actress.
And the lady that actually plays her today, Felicity, seems to me to be quite an extraordinary person in her own right, because there are shades of Julie Walters going on there as well.
Oh,
I mean,
yes,
I so recently went to see the sort of full-scale production of Acorn Antiques, and I could actually see her as Mrs. Overall. She's very clever.
Oh, yes. I mean, at the end we do a little bit of a surprise moment for the audience. I won't give too much away, but we present one of the characters Betty Marsden played, called B. Clissold. It was an ongoing saga, the Clissold saga, and we do a little extract from that, showing the young B and then the elderly B. And you're quite right. When I helped Felicity up this afternoon in this afternoon's performance, I looked at her face, and yes, she was the spitting image of Julie Walters in Acorn Antiques as Mrs. Overall.
Well, if they have to tour the provinces, and let's hope they do, then perhaps there'll be a part for Felicity in it. I've absolutely no doubt about that. How much are you enjoying this? Because it's a very, very long tour. I mean, is it easy to go out there in the evening and, like this afternoon as well, night after night?
I think so, yeah, because the material is such fun to perform, and invariably the audience enjoy it, and the thing takes off during the performance. So it's fantastic when the audience is great, and that you can have a huge party, and especially as Kenneth Williams, because people give you the impetus and also the justification to go off and add extra ad-libs and things like that. So sometimes you kind of get an extra special audience that kind of make it an almost unique experience. So
You're throwing out a challenge for our Cambridgeshire audiences.
We are.
So let's
Throwing
hope,
down the gauntlet.
let's hope they match up to it. Stephen Critchlow plays Kenneth Horne in the production. Of course, with any great show, there must always be an anchorman. And I have to say that it's only within about 5 minutes into the production, and as far as I'm concerned, he is and was and definitely couldn't be anybody else but Kenneth Horne. He's quite incredible.
Yes, and as you say, to be honest, it's really difficult to find an actor to be able to portray that, because you look at it and you think it's deceptively simple to find someone to take on that task of playing Kenneth Horne, and it wasn't, because Kenneth Horne had so many qualities about him, that fatherly sort of figure that he had, the master puppeteer, and a very warm kind of convivial quality that he had with him, and to find somebody that can reproduce that and also to physically resemble him as well is no mean feat, and they've done very well in finding Stephen Critchlow. It's great.
Even down to the RAF tie, indeed.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
And also as well with Stephen, he loves the material. I mean, we've all listened to the programmes before we did the show, in fact, even before we were cast in the show. But Stephen especially, I mean, he knows them like the back of his hand. It really is a labour of love for Stephen.
Yeah, he's actually a self-confessed anorak. I mean, he would say that, isn't he? He said, absolutely, I've got them all. He really adores it.
Thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.
Stephen Matthews and David Rumelle at the Cambridge Arts Theatre next week in Round the Horne Revisited. And Nicola and I, as I said, got not more than a sneak preview. We went to see the whole show at Windsor this week. Because I remembered it, went looking for, I suppose, a little bit of nostalgia. Why did you go?
Well, I went because really I knew absolutely nothing about the original show whatsoever. I mean, I'd heard of it, and I'd probably heard snippets on those, golden compilation things that they do. But I went because I just loved the idea of it. I love the idea of recreating that whole golden age of radio. And the way that they would actually record the shows in the old days with a live audience who felt very, very special and queued for hours to get there. I think it was 120 tickets or something they have for these recordings. And actually the audience would be part of the show. And what a clever idea to recreate that in a stage show, because that is exactly what you get when you go to see this. You feel like you are the invited audience for the recording of a radio show. And because the cast are so good, it does... I mean, the only person I really know in terms of real terms was Kenneth Williams. Of course. So I can only really judge it on that. But certainly from the performance by Stephen Matthews there, it's so genuinely authentic that you really, really get a sense of you are there in the original radio shows and being part of something very special, because it is an audience participation thing. They recreate the radio stage wonderfully in terms of the applause lights that flash on either side, and so you really do feel that you're a part of it.
And the other thing about radio, of course, is that, that's why I've worked in it for so many years now. Radio is magical, principally because until the age of the webcam, which of course we have in here now, you could create magic. I mean, for 2 or 3 years we had a bird bath in here with 400 listeners in it of a Saturday morning. Because you said it, people believe it. And I think that's what's fabulous about the Round the Horne thing. Now, seeing it behind the scenes, almost like taken apart, you see these people come to the microphone and suddenly become somebody else purely by facial expressions and voice. That's clever.
It is.
No costume.
What is particularly wonderful about this stage version is you have so many layers to it. You have a fabulous cast of actors who are in their own turn playing real people, who then create this whole repertoire of other characters. So you've got 3 layers of interest there. And as you say, the magic of radio, if you didn't know, you would think literally there were probably a cast of tens and hundreds on that stage. So fantastically do they create this huge variety of characters, all of whom are equally funny. And it's like having a miniature rep company to draw on then, that just with a twist of a nose or a tone of a voice or a particular way of saying something, or obviously in the case of these characters they all have a little catchphrase as well. You can draw on that wonderful thing, and you can imagine really that as people were listening to it, in the same way as perhaps if you watched the 2 Ronnies later on, or if you watch Victoria Wood and Acorn Antiques and all that sort of thing these days, everybody will have their own favourite characters, and that there were genuine kind of oohs and ahs in the audience when their own particular favourite character came up, whether it was Rambling Sid Rumper or Julian and Sandy. Clearly everybody had their own favourite bit that they were looking forward to, and that was lovely.